topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately, and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, Texas, which is home base for me. If you don't know me yet, I'm a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, organizational logotherapist, inspirational speaker, social scientist, and author. You can learn more about me and how we can work together at elisecortez.com or gusto-now.com. Let me thank my partner and sponsor, Workproud. We are a perfect collaboration. Everyone wants to know they matter and that the work they do is meaningful and appreciated. Workproud is a mobile platform built to encourage employees to share stories and recognize each other's contribution. Workproud empowers HR and business leaders to create company cultures where all employees are inspired to feel proud of their work and proud of their company. Learn more at workproud.com. With us today is Sean Harvey, the Chief Compassion Officer and Compassionate Masculinity Guide at Symponia Men's Studio based in Washington, D.C. Sean is contributing as a writer, speaker, consultant to an emerging narrative around the next frontier of men's healing and transformation through compassionate masculinity and integrating compassion into traditionally masculine systems and cultures. We'll be talking about his path to his own purpose, why the world needs the work that he does today, and the work that he does in service of his mission. He joins us today from Washington, D.C. Reverend Sean, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise. It's great to be here.
It's amazing to have you with me. And I am really looking forward to this juicy, meaningful conversation. So glad our paths crossed. So to get us started here, this first segment, I really did want to talk more about really who you are and how you became the person that you are. Many people want to understand, how can I discover my purpose? And so in this first part, I hope that in your sharing, they'll start to be able to glean some things for themselves by listening to you to gain access to their own path. So let's talk about just what you set out to do professionally. I mean, I know you have a bachelor's in industrial organizational psychology, a master's in organizational development, a master's in education and counseling, and then you worked as a consultant on Wall Street and for big media companies. And so this is quite an interesting journey that you've been on.
To say the least. To say the least. You know, I pretty much played the game until I turned 40, where I was heading up a consulting division for Wall Street clients. I was a college professor. And on my 40th birthday, I had had enough of trying to create magic happen in 2 hours. And also, I think I was just tired of the hyper-masculine cultures that were predominated so many organizations. And as a professor of management, I was studying a lot of them. And around the time that I left the firm, an opportunity came along at Eileen Fisher, the women's fashion company. And the entire business model was based on the feminine, not just feminine leadership, but it was a feminine energy company. And it was an interesting place because the structures and systems didn't operate in a way that women were being asked to act like men to succeed in business. But women were able to be in the full expression of who they were to succeed in the organization. And they did very well. And so it really, as a systems thinker, I just was experiencing one system and going to the other, going, there's something radically different here. And I think how I found my purpose was I ultimately became the head of purpose, personal transformation, and well-being for the company. But along the way, I did probably 5 different purpose retreats in the company to discover my own purpose, to look at my own limiting beliefs, to look at my own shadow work, to look at my ego work. and to really discover from my journey what I was called to do. And then at Eileen Fisher, I was also sent to an artist commune for 5 months in Canada to learn how to incorporate the arts into creative facilitation. And that experience was also just transformational and got me more steeped in what my purpose and call was. And when I started at Eileen Fisher, quite honestly, I went there so I wouldn't have to work with men again. I left Eileen Fisher realizing I'm supposed to do work with men based on what I learned at Eileen Fisher. I knew it was beyond my pay grade, so then I went to seminary to get the spiritual grounding I needed to be able to hold this work in the way it needs to be held.
That was probably the most beautiful and crisp rendition of a life that I think I've ever heard. That is so beautiful, Sean. Thank you. For listeners and viewers, for those of you who don't know who Eileen Fisher is, it's important that you recognize just who this company is. So they are a B Corp women's clothing company with roughly $425 million in annual revenue and 1,200 employees across the US, UK, and Canada. And they are comprised of 83% women and subscribe fully to and unapologetically to feminine leadership principles and practices. So what I really appreciate is, one, how you found your way, that you actually, did you go knocking at Eileen Fisher's door? Did they find you? It seems a little bit unlikely that the two of you would meet and want to marry, if you will.
So our sales guy at the firm I worked for said, hey, I think you should check out this. I think you should try to sell to this company called Eileen Fisher. There's someone there I think you connect with spiritually. And we hit it off. And pretty much around the time that I was, and the thing that was interesting was every time I was trying to sell, because at the firm I was really developing creative solutions for our clients. So, and I just kept trying to sell these offerings, and they're like, no, we're good, we already do that. No, we're good, we already do that. I mean, they meditate. There's Tibetan singing bowls in every conference room, as every meeting starts with a moment of silence and meditation. So if you have 8 meetings a day, you have 8 minutes, you have 8 moments of silence and meditation. And by the time I left, I would just joke. I'm like, I'm going to give you chime coaching now, so you can like allow the reverberation from the singing bowl to just do what it needs to do. And so my friend that I was trying to sell to, we had become friends, and she said, hey, we're looking for an internal organization development partner. Do you know anyone that might be interested? And I said, honestly, I think I would. And so I applied, went on an 8-month interview process, and I got the job. But I think this is the pivotal moment that transformed everything. It was the first day on the job, and my 2 bosses sat me down over lunch, and they said these words. They said, Sean, you have proven yourself in the interview process. We now want you to stop proving yourself and learn to be who you authentically are. We hired you. We saw when you interviewed with us, we saw your heart and we saw your polish as a New York City consultant, management consultant. We hired you for your heart, and we want to see less of your polish. We want to see you unfiltered and unedited, and we're going to help you do that.
Wow, what an opportunity.
Yeah.
So listeners and viewers, as you're listening to this, I want you to really pay attention. This is a thought leadership platform that's advancing the conversation on creating cultures where people thrive, inspirational leaders lead people to their greatness, and business is working at its highest impact. And what you're experiencing and seeing here is consciousness on the rise. And I really just want to showcase that this whole notion of spirituality in the workplace and all of these well-being practices that Sean is starting to refer to are becoming more of the norm of the forward-thinking organizations. So just really want to showcase just how amazing what you've done with your life and where you landed and where that's taken you. It's phenomenal. It's very inspiring.
I think one thing that, just to kind of take the point one step further. So at Eileen Fisher, as part of our wellness offerings, we had access to Akashic records readers, medical intuitives, astrologers, as part of our enriched well-being. And so for those who don't know, I ended up seeing an Akashic reader probably on a quarterly, if not biannual basis. And for those who don't know what an Akashic reader is, it's basically someone who channels or can connect with the spiritual guides, and they're really telling you how you're in alignment or out of alignment with your soul contract. and really looking at your soul DNA. So I think to take the idea of spirituality in the workplace to that degree of how are you aligned head, heart, and spiritually in the workplace, or head, heart, and spirit, that integration and the permission to be able to have deep and rich conversations and exploration of that makes you a whole person.
Mm. You know, that's, as you know, totally speaking my language. So thank you for sharing that. So you had mentioned in our first exchange, I think that you said that there were like 5 experiences that you went through, Eileen Fisher, that really helped steward your path to purpose. I know we can't talk about all of them maybe, but was part of that, was that one of your experiences that helped?
I would say, yeah, I think the working with the Akashic Reader, doing the purpose workshops and working with my mentor at Eileen Fisher, who was a consultant named Marcelo out of Brazil, who worked with Ken Wilber and Otto Scharmer. And so we had a lot of Ken Wilber and Otto Scharmer influence in the organization, along with Frederick Laloux. And really, as we were moving to a more conscious organization, like those were the thought leaders that were really in the orbit of the organization.
Wow, forefront. That is amazing. Well, share with us, if you will, Sean, because again, so many of our listeners are they're so hungry to discover their purpose, and they're working at it, and you know, they are looking for ways to be able to activate it. So you've gone through and done a lot of work on your shadows, on your ego, and you've done a lot of these experiences that came through Eileen Fisher. Will you share maybe 1 or 2 of them and just how they helped you? What did you do and how did they help you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we looked at in the purpose work, I think so much of it comes down to the purpose work that we did. And part of the experience was to look at our unmet needs and to understand what unmet needs we had from childhood and how they're still playing out for us in our adulthood.
Yeah.
You know, so that examination we did. But then I think, you know, when we really go to the place of where our shame and discomfort is, that's often the place where our purpose lies. And so when we can go to that place of discomfort and go into it with courage and go into it, and for me, so much of it was my fear of men. So much of it was my fear of not living up to the masculine ideal. So much of it was not being considered man enough. So much of it was how I was as a gay man, you know, positioning and posturing myself so I could be acceptable. And within that, living in that mask, how much I was living, you know, and quite honestly, the way I was living, I had an amazing resume. I knew that my validity, my validation as a man could come from my credentials, my education, and the jobs that I took. So I was very conscious of that. But then when you look at my personal life, it was anemic. You know, the inability to have close relationships, having a dating life that was always in kaputs. And just, you know, living to work as opposed to working to live. And so I think that imbalance was an indicator. I remember going in to talk to our wellness director at Eileen Fisher. I was like, why do we have to have life when we can have work? It's all about, you know, it's coming from Wall Street. 80-hour weeks are amazing. You know, that was, and she just looked at me with this love and compassion and basically this look of like, dear boy, you will learn. And over the 5 years, I really learned what that integration meant, and that to live a life on purpose does not mean sacrificing your life. It doesn't mean that when you follow the call that you can't have a meaningful life outside of the work you do. Yet there's a blending between the work you do and the work you're called to do.
Mm-hmm. As a meaning work researcher, I did discover that I found these 15 modes of engagement, and there's lots of ways to be able to live our purpose and express it. But one of them it's called living your purpose, and it's just sort of this thread where it's just you and the work are sort of inseparable, and it's just who you are in the world,
Yeah.
and you do it in service of others. And so somewhere in there, Sean, you made this realization that you went to Eileen Fisher because you didn't want to work with men anymore, but somehow made the realization that you needed to be able to help men somehow.
Yeah.
So if you would do two things for us, help us understand how you emerged, what was happening at Eileen Fisher to help you arrive at that point. And then I'd like to hear how you articulate your purpose today. You mentioned at the beginning, but maybe it'll be slightly different as a statement.
Yeah. I think there were probably 3 moments where it really kind of became crystal clear. The first was 5 years ago. I was in Barcelona and I was on vacation, having a miserable vacation in Barcelona because I didn't know what to do on vacation. But I know.
Okay. Noted.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to go back and relive that experience. But I got the message when I was in Barcelona that as men, we've not been socialized to socialize in healthy ways. And that just kept like following me around when I was in Barcelona. Then when I was doing the purpose work with Marcelo, it just kept coming through. But it was when I really declared it, it was the first weekend of being in the artist commune when I got clear, like, this is the work. And then everything started to fall into place. But it was when I think at Eileen Fisher, what I started noticing was I noticed how all the experiences, I was just being transformed into a better version of myself. I was more comfortable in my own skin. I was feeling transformed. I was happier. My relationships were starting to gel, and I started to have a life. But it was when I started asking other men in the company, because like you said, it's an 83% women. So the 17% of us, and most of the men in the company were either working in IT, in the distribution center, some throughout fashion, but kind of more of the more traditional roles, right? But I would ask these guys, I'm like, so, I feel like I'm changing, I'm transforming. Are you experiencing this? And the way it would come through for them, they'd be like, yeah, my wife said that I listen differently, or that I'm more patient, or I stopped needing to be right all the time and I started to get more curious and ask more questions. I started to be more comfortable with nuanced conversation and with nuance. I started to have more access to my emotional expression, and I was able to, and I noticed that my creativity was shifting and evolving. I was able to be more creative and more ideas, and I could ideate differently. And I think we all were saying, when women are able to be their full selves in an environment like this, it automatically gives men permission to come into their full selves. So the more that we can create this equity for women to truly not fit into a model that's been forced upon them, but for them to come into their authenticity. And for those who don't identify as male or female, or in the non-binary or gender fluid, organizations that really embrace the full person, that's ultimately going to allow men to come into a different level of freedom and liberation for themselves, which then can unlock the power dynamics that then allow more non-male identified humans to be able to take greater roles of influence.
Beautiful, Sean. Let's let that sit in for just a while here for our listeners and viewers and grab our first break. I'm Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Sean Harvey, the Chief Compassion Officer and Compassionate Masculinity Guide at Symponia Men's Studio based in Washington, D.C. We've been talking about his path purpose. After the break, we're going to get into why the world needs the work that he's doing. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, ALISE at EliseCortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. As I've watched the pandemic continue on, we look for ways to help companies support their employees handle anxiety, stress, depression, and feeling disconnected, while also helping lift and inspire them with ongoing professional development. So we now offer a well-being learning webinar series called Grab Your Gusto, Vital Wellbeing from the Inside Out. You can learn more about it at EliseCortez.com or send me an email to elise@elisecortez.com. If you're just joining the program, my guest is Sean Harvey, the Chief Compassion Officer and Compassionate Masculinity Guide at Symponia's Men's Studio based in Washington, D.C. Sean is contributing as a writer, speaker, and consultant to an emerging narrative around the next frontier of men's healing and transformation through compassionate masculinity and integrating compassion into traditionally masculine systems and cultures. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So for this next segment here, Sean, I want to get into what you see in the world and why you think that the work you're doing is so important. So one of the great things about purpose, and you know this, is it gives us, when we stand in our own purpose, a very unique lens that only we can use to be able to see what's missing or needed in the world that we could solve. So if you would, start by sharing your perspective on what's happening in our world today that provokes and makes your work with compassion so important.
So the name of the company, Symponia. Symponia is the Greek word for compassion.
I didn't know that.
Compassionate, basically compassionate men's studio. And I think when I was thinking about my company, and I launched January of 2019. When I was thinking about it, I think we were in the middle of a healthcare debate. And I was like, with the politicians, and I'm like, where's the compassion in this process? And then I started thinking about the thing that's most needed in organizations is compassion. When we talk about woke culture, there's often a lot of judgment in it. It's like, where's the compassion? Where are we honoring people in their journeys? And now a lot of my work is with police, military, and federal law enforcement. There's a whole opportunity for work around compassion in those spaces, both among the agencies, the departments, and the officers and the agents, as well as the communities that are served. And so how are we holding our organizational systems from this place of love and compassion? And I think at the root of, and I think compassion is such a beautiful entry point into so much of this work, because it can blend, it can move between the secular and the spiritual and speak to everyone. And so, but there's an opportunity when we come, and the way I define compassion is the awareness and the response to preventing suffering for ourselves and others. Yeah.
Last week, sorry, Sean, please go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to add in that to that end, last week my guest was Dr. Arthur C. Macaulay, who has written a book called America Reunited, where essentially he's putting forth this, and I like to say these are his doctor's orders because he's a clinical psychologist, that what we really need in our divide is empathy and the ability to be able to sit and listen with curiosity versus throwing barbs of hatred and judgment. And when did we lose the ability to actually have discourse and to learn? So I think there are so many applications to the work that you're doing. And I realize that you've launched only just a couple of years ago, which is phenomenal what you've already done. But I am curious, when you're out talking to people who maybe don't know you, and you tell them your title and the work that you're doing, I'd love to hear the general range of responses that you get.
I've been talking about this for 5 years. I want to say one thing, though, before I go there. There's often such an association with compassion as something that's soft or weak.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think we need to bring the masculinity conversation in, because I think there's so much in the narrative of masculinity that defines how we look at compassion and the soft skills. And yet, if we understand the roots of why we think the way we think, we can actually start to see compassion from a place of strength that only strengthens our masculinity. And so that's why I always see when we can bridge, and I often, when I was a professor, as a consultant, when I can bridge juxtaposed ideas like compassion and masculinity into one place, it becomes a conversation starter. I've been talking about this for 5 years, and quite honestly, not one person has objected to what I've said. I haven't gotten the pushback. I've gotten cynical questions, like, how does this work? Especially when I was just starting out in the conversation, a little more clumsy. But I haven't gotten people like objecting. And I think part of that is we hear so much about toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. We're basically operating from a dualistic perspective that there's a right, wrong, good, bad. Right? But if we are embracing our full humanity, we embrace our essence and our shadow. Masculinity is a construct that's outside of us, yet so many of us have internalized it as a reflection of us. It's really what holds social conditioning that tells us our shoulds, who we should be, how we should show up, and what we have access to in terms of the energies we can express, and how it frames the way we look at our gender identity and expression. But if we're able to take a step back and say, this is just a construct, and if we can embrace the construct for its essence and its shadow fully, and it's a thing, and we wrap it in compassion, what does it do to that thing? Right? And so I think when I'm talking about compassion and masculinity, it's coming from a place of love, not judgment. It's coming from a place that the masculine. So I think in some ways, historically, we've demonized the feminine, and now I think we're in an age where we're demonizing the masculine.
Yes.
And I think in reality, it's not about being in one direction or the other. It's really, what does it look like for each of us to embody an integration of both in a more balanced way? And when we're able to do that, when we're out of balance, it's not, are you good, bad, right, or wrong? The question I always ask is, what's the cost? What's the cost if you can't tap into your feminine energy, which is your nurturing, caring side? What's the cost if you can't tap into your masculine, which is going to be where you get things done, where you move things forward, where you have structure? You know, it's like the more we're able to be in this balance, the more we have an agility to dance in our own humanity and respond to situations coming to us in a way that just makes us more whole, more human, and more mature.
Ooh, and that's exactly why for years I've been attracted to androgyny, for that very reason, because to me it represents the possibility of being whole and complete and expressing all of ourselves and drawing from both traditionally idealistic notions of femininity and masculinity. So, I mean, I can't even explain to you how long my fascination has been with that. And here it comes. It's just the way you expressed it so beautifully, that wholeness and completeness and authenticity. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is really interesting about you is that you are out to help very masculine, or as you say, hyper masculine environments and cultures to develop compassion. So I'm interested in what kinds of organizations are good prospects for you. You already mentioned that. I think you said you were working with military and police. I didn't catch what else, but what other organizations are good prospects that maybe in listening to this, they didn't quite recognize that they were a good prospect to work with you?
I think in reality, 90% of all organizational systems and institutions are based on a masculine model.
Yeah.
Right? And those masculine models haven't allowed for the feminine expression. And we're starting to see HR practices that embody this. We just don't call it, coming from the feminine. But in reality, a lot of times we're creating policies and procedures that are band-aids on environments that are competitive, environments that are very results-driven, that are very quantifiable, and don't really account for the human experience. They're based on productivity, not as much on the human experience. And even as we move into this idea of human-centered workplace design, the question I always have is, that's an amazing concept, but are we really shifting the systems and the policies in a way that allow for someone to come into their full power from their authentic being into an organization and be accepted and be appreciated? Or are we going to say they're not a cultural fit? And so I think I think right now we're in a period where we're trying to figure this out. There's a lot of well-intentioned ideas, and there are practices that work. The question is, how deep are we going in terms of really reshaping organizations and rethinking them? And can organizational systems be redesigned in a more integrated way, a more inclusive way, a more conscious way, a more compassionate way that allows us to be connected in new ways?
Well, we're having this conversation, you and I, in June of 2021. And there is research out there today that says that about 50% of the workforce, at least in North America, plans to change jobs this year. Mm-hmm. And part of that is just due to the pent-up frustration and restlessness of being in the pandemic. Some of it has to do with not feeling connected to their company. Much of it has to do with not feeling valued and appreciated. And then you have this whole notion of what's called the Great Resignation that's happening out there, where people, the pandemic has really started to showcase why the work that we do and the way we do it is not working. So in my view, right now is a perfect time to have a conversation about how can we look at our cultures and the way that we treat and manage our people to bring in more of this compassion, because it will make them want to stay longer and give more of their all versus voting with their feet.
Yeah. You know, I've been in DC for about 9 weeks now. Since coming here, I've been asked to do this work, bring compassion and masculinity into police departments, federal law enforcement, like I said, military, to work with white, straight, evangelical men, to work with Black men from historically Black colleges and universities, to work with aeronautical corporations, in aerospace, and now to work with the NFL. And so I think there's a need, and then when I talk to folks in NGOs, when I talk to people in the government, when I talk to people in startups, there's still an opportunity to rethink how we're considering organization design, how we're thinking about the systems, and how we're thinking about the leadership practices that move from this place of fear-based control to compassion-based empowerment.
How beautiful. So before we go into our next segment here, I think this makes sense at this point here now. If you would say a little bit about your soul's calling and at your core, why you do this work, and of course, how your journey has led you to it. You've kind of sprinkled along through our conversation, but now if you could bring it together for us so we can thread it all through and see what it really is.
So this was not the plan of my parents. I was supposed to be a third generation long haul trucker. And
boy, did you screw up.
I so screwed up. And you mentioned androgyny, and so probably from probably from 7 to about 12 years old, maybe 13. I was pretty androgynous. People couldn't tell if I was a boy or a girl. Often people thought I was a girl. And I had so much shame around that I wouldn't even correct them. So it wasn't even like I was choosing to be gender fluid. It was like androgyny had chosen me. And I was living from that perspective. So I think I've been part of this exploration since I was very young, very conscious of it. And then I came out as a gay man when I was 15. I started a gay and lesbian youth group for the city of Dayton, Ohio when I was 16, which still exists today. And often that was my barometer of making career decisions over time, was what was that thing I did at 16 that was when my heart was flush with possibility. And I was creating and ideating and creating something that still exists today, 31 years later. And then I went off to college, and I thought I was going to study corporate finance and work on Wall Street as a Wall Street dude. And I ended up studying industrial and organizational psychology, and then just my path went in that direction. But I think studying organizational change first, being a professor and teaching for 10 years, working on Wall Street, then working in fashion, then going to seminary, being a gay activist back in the day. I just think so many of these things gave me some perspectives, and I just think it still blows me away that I'm talking to, cops and FBI agents and former FBI agents and military folks and Marines, and about compassion as a queer man doing this, and they're listening, and someone from Quantico said to me recently, he said, with the police work, he said, Sean, he had listened to me for 2.5 hours, and like, this was sort of a test, right? Like, how is he going to receive this? And he said, I can't object to anything you've just said. Nothing that you said is off-putting to me. He said, you're not training cops to be better cops. You're developing officers into better humans. Who can argue with that? And I think when we take everything that's going on in the world, right, and we take the division, and we take the perceptions, and we take the problems, yet when we take someone back to their core humanity and say, we give you permission to be human, I think that's what opens the door to all the other change. But we're trying to create the change without getting people to come into their humanness. And we're not seeing each other human to human, soul to soul. And I think that's where we lose out on actually trying to create the bridges that we need to create to innovate and solve the challenges that are in front of us. And we're trying to force upon, you have to change so that this can work, as opposed to come into your own heart, come into your own relationship with love, self-love, and then ask how you love others. And when you're in that frame of mind, and you take the judgment out and the rightness out and the righteousness out of it, then you have an opportunity to say, so now what's possible in our connection when we can see each other in this more soulful, more human, and more humane way.
And with that, I'm going to take us into our last break. So listeners and viewers, if you would just reflect a bit on what Sean said about his journey and how far back he could trace it back. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Sean Harvey, the Chief Compassion Officer and Compassionate Masculinity Guide at Symponia Men's Studio based in Washington, D.C. We've been talking about his path to purpose. After the break, we're going to talk about the work that he does and how it makes a difference. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I mentioned after the first break about the Grab Your Gusto Wellbeing webinar learning series. The content of that program came from the part one of my recently published book called Purpose Ignited, How Inspiring Leaders Ignite Passion and Elevate Cause, which is now available on Amazon. I wrote that book to awaken readers to their passion and purpose and help transform them into inspirational leaders who enliven the workplace and elevate the contribution of the business to all stakeholders. So that's where the content came from. If you're just joining us, my guest today from Washington, D.C. is Sean Harvey of the Symponia Men's Study. He is also contributing as a writer, speaker, and consultant to an emerging narrative around the next frontier of men's healing and transformation through compassionate masculinity and integrating compassion into traditionally masculine systems and cultures. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So for this last bit of time together here, Sean, I wanted to get into some of the work that you do so that our listeners and viewers can better understand how they might access you and how you might be able to help them. Mm-hmm. So you describe your work at Symponia as a leadership institute dedicated to helping the next generation of compassion-centered bridge builders, facilitators, leaders, and change makers equipped to form authentic and purpose-driven communities, innovate collaboratively, redefine leadership models, reimagine systems and structures, and transform cultures. That's just awesome work. So would you just say a little bit about the kind of work that you're principally doing? What are you principally focused on? Obviously, men and cultures.
Mm-hmm. So, I thought about this, like who's my audience? And I guess these days it's who's your avatar. And to create the scale that I'm envisioning, this really is working with that level you talked about, what I consider the lever points. So I'm not really the guy for everyone. I typically work with the facilitators, the bridge builders, the change makers, and the leaders who can create scale. If the message can come to them, then it can go into the systems that they operate in. And so then bringing in a compassion-centered, soul-inspired approach and bringing people into that deeper level of consciousness. What I've found is that's where I've been, and now when I bring it to the work with men, it's really still operating at that level. And the intellectual part, the compassionate part, and the soulful part are so intertwined, I can't tease them out.
Yeah.
And so it just comes through, and I think it's part of what comes through in the flow. To really, I think all these pieces have been building blocks to be able to create experiences. Now, so studios are basically retreats. It's just that there's something about the language I use are boot camps, so compassion boot camp, compassion and masculinity lab, and a men's studio. So really an introduction into compassion, the play of more of like a lab of how do we experiment and play with compassion and masculinity. How do they work, and how do we move from experiencing compassion to expressing compassion? And then how do we do the deeper inner work in the studio that allows us to really come into our wholeness? Then there's another piece of the work that's been really near and dear to me, and I think it's part of my journey. I think it's a struggle for so many men, which is retreats for men on the relationship to love, sex, and intimacy. Because I believe that if we want to be true bridge builders, we have to get in relationship with our own ability to be in intimacy with ourselves and others, because in so many ways we're often disconnected. And the way I often describe it is, for so many of us, there's the intimacy that we desire and yearn for. There's a love that we often misunderstand, and there's a sex that we settle for. And we often get them confused, and it often creates a lot of turmoil for us as we're figuring out how to have healthy relationships, healthy families, and to find our partners. And that all translates then into how we create friendships. The statistic that I've seen, a study often says men stop making friends at 35. And often they will take on the friends of their wives or their significant others. And so that factor of loneliness, disconnection, is so profound, and there's often not the coping skills for men to be able to get those needs met. And so that's often where we then go into these issues of alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, sex addiction, porn addiction, whatever that may be, is finding the coping mechanism that's going to work for us, but it's still not leading us into healthier ways of being that actually give us a fulfilling life.
That was a beautiful rendition of what you're addressing and how you're lifting. And one of the reasons I keep hosting the show, Sean, after 6 years, I think you're episode number 331, is because I continue to learn from my guests. They teach me, they elevate me. So the conceptual part of the show is really important because it's the educational inspiration component. But now, if you would next, I ask you to think a little bit about an example of a group that you've worked with and helped, so that our listeners and viewers can understand, who are you working with? Why did they think they want to work with you? Because we know sometimes the why becomes different along the way. And what were the results? What was different afterwards?
Yeah, I'll go most recent. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I started something called Facilitator Edge, which was creating a space for facilitators. Because when I saw, we were going into this pandemic, and I was like, whoa, every facilitator around the world just had their world rock because they can't facilitate in-person events and meetings, right? It's like they either have to learn Zoom, they were losing contracts, and because that's part of my community, I said, maybe there's an opportunity, and so I created something called Facilitator Edge, which was a weekly conversation for facilitators. And it was really, how do we create meaningful connection in virtual spaces? How do we continue to keep our communities thriving in the virtual world? And how do we need to evolve to hold the space? And really, it's as we see the crumbling systems around us, the systems that are being dismantled, we haven't rebuilt them. So we're kind of in this place of unknowing right now. As facilitators, how do we hold the space for the unknowing, and how do we get in touch with our own ability to surrender and flow in the not knowing and be in the emergent? And so we did that for about a year, and we reached 575 facilitators from 15 countries.
Wow!
Having just through LinkedIn. And just, connections. And then there were people that just kept continuing with me. And that morphed into, I became a minister, an interfaith minister last June. So it was actually a year ago this week, I became an interfaith minister. And I then launched something called Soulful Facilitation. How do we bring soul into the spaces that we hold? And how do we create sacred space? And how do we start to move from tools, techniques, and strategies into the surrender of art and ceremony? And now with men's work, it'll be art, ceremony, and initiation. And a ritual, ceremony, and initiation. And so those conversations then led to a training program that I do called the Soulful Facilitator Intensive. And really, I think it was this blend of facilitators coming into a more deeper sense of themselves, relaxing the ego, getting off the script, and the ability to flow with the energy of the space. And this thing that I often say as facilitators, contrary to popular belief, the more invisible we become as facilitators, the more powerful the containers we create, because we make it less about us. And it's that dance of we're often intelligent human beings. We don't need to tell people how smart we are. And we can actually just let the embodiment of our ability to hold that space showcase our ability. And so it's the dance of the ego. And so that's really been transformative. And now I've been 1 foot in and 1 foot out with the men's work for the last 5 years, and definitely for the last 2.5 years, out of fear, out of scarcity, out of this is impractical, I should do something more practical and more mainstream. But the way the spiritual journey works and the way the spiritual call works is you can run away, but you can't hide, because it's going to find you. It's going to keep reminding you that this is your work. And so now I'm 100% all in on the men's work. And so I don't have as many stories to tell, because this is really in its infancy. It's been conceptualizing, and I've been doing my own work to be able to hold the work in the ways that it needs to. And I'm settling into the comfort of knowing that, and knowing that now I'm ready to, in some ways, walk into the lion's den and really hold these conversations and hold the healing, the possibility, and the transformation for men to come into their best selves, without trying to hold an agenda that it needs to look like anything other than what is authentic to them, and liberates them into their full possibility and into their full humanity.
That is a fantastic way to finish, Sean. What a beautiful, beautiful narration rendition. And it's completely palpable that you're in that space, that journey. And I'm so happy to know you. I'm so happy to share you with our listeners across the globe who need your message and your work desperately. And I want to thank you very much for saying yes to being on the show, and yes to sharing so beautifully.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about Sean and the work that he's doing, it's easy as just to start to go to symponiamen.com. Let me spell that for you. SYMPONIAMON. Yes, MON. Yeah, MEN.
MEN.
MEN.com, Symponian.com, SymponiaMen.com.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want to make sure you can find him. And he just created this fresh as well. So it's just got some brand new information on it and lots of resources and things that he can share with you. Thanks again to our partnering sponsor, Workproud, which helps companies build a platform where your workforce receives meaningful feedback. And thanks for the work from people across your company. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it recorded podcast. We were on the air with Dr. Arthur Sir McCauley, a fourth-time guest, this time talking about his latest book, America Reunited, a relational solution to bridging the political, social, and personal chasm dividing our nation. Next week, we'll be on air with Frank Calderoni, who is the chairman and CEO of Anapan and the author of Upstanding, How Company Character Catalyzes Loyalty, Agility, and Hypergrowth, in which he argues that a character-led culture is not just for reputation, but integral to the strategy of every winning company. See you there. Remember that work's at least a third of our life, so let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.